So, today I want to talk about Puerto Rico and Hurricane Fiona. It's been 5 years since Hurricane Maria devastated the island of Puerto Rico, causing almost 3,000 deaths, untold material damage, left half the population without tap water, and absolutely debilitated Puerto Rico's electric grid. Years have passed, and because of a combination of explicit colonial and imperial policies by the United States involving debt and austerity, as well as inept management and a withholding of necessary relief money, many of the repairs from the damage caused by Hurricane Maria had not even begun to be started by 2021 when it was predicted that a Category 1 hurricane could devastate the island again. In the 5 years since Maria, Puerto Ricans have endured earthquakes, the global pandemic, devastated infrastructure, and rolling blackouts, while blue tarp sat draped over where homes once were. And now here we are, 5 years later in 2022, and Hurricane Fiona just made landfall on Sunday. And it's a familiar scene in the aftermath. Power outages across the island that are likely to last for at least days, tap water not flowing to about two-thirds of the population of the island, and now massive flooding that's wrecking infrastructure. So after 5 years, how did this happen? How are we back in the same spot, if not worse, where Puerto Rico is trying to recover now from multiple disasters? Well, it's a combination of imperialism and colonialism, privatization, as well as climate change. So first, we need to talk about imperialism and colonialism. I cannot even begin to address the full extent of the long history of the United States' imperial and colonial practices in Puerto Rico in this one video. That said, I think it is sufficient to say that with things like using Puerto Ricans as test subjects for birth control and sterilization programs, to the tax loopholes that were granted US corporations on the island, to the military testing and bombing of the island of Vieques, the United States has consistently exploited the people and land of Puerto Rico since it was taken over by the United States in 1898 and often has implemented purposeful colonial policies on the island. That said, the bulk of this current struggle begins in response to Puerto Rico's debt. And while this is going to be a gross oversimplification of the history, because of historical imperial practices by the United States, Puerto Rico was unable to declare bankruptcy on its own debt like most US states can. The United States' solution was to implement a passage of the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, also known as Promesa. Now, Promesa implemented a ton of austerity measures that has utterly failed the island. So we have here a report called Promesa Has Failed, How a Colonial Board is Enriching Wall Street and Hurting Puerto Ricans. And in this report, it outlines a lot of the austerity measures that have gone on across the island. But if we read through the introduction here, we can see, although Congress passed Promesa to provide much-needed relief to Puerto Rico in the midst of a crushing debt crisis, the board has used its power to impose devastating austerity measures and negotiate unsustainable debt restructuring plans that enrich Wall Street and hurt Puerto Ricans. These two approaches both stunt economic development and growth and make it very likely that Puerto Rico's debt will soon become unsustainable again. The unelected and unaccountable board has failed to deliver on Promesa's key mandates of representing the interests of PR in the debt restructuring proceedings and helping PR achieve balanced budgets and regain access to capital markets. Meanwhile, the board has continued to push fiscal plans that impose harmful austerity cuts, ensure hefty payments to bondholders and Wall Street firms, and take advantage of federal disaster relief funds to secure larger payouts for Wall Street bondholders. As well, under the board's watch, Puerto Rican communities are contending with decimated public services, limited resources to rebuild their homes and businesses, and a struggling economy that cannot support them. During its tenure, the board has privatized the publicly owned power grid and pushed rate hikes on utility customers. It has weakened labor protections for workers. It has imposed massive cuts in education funding, and over 250 schools have closed. Proposed cutting pensions for public sector workers by 8.5%, imposed significant cuts to healthcare and the state-run Medicaid program, and narrowed eligibility for vital food assistance programs. These austerity measures are being imposed on communities that already face an enormous degree of economic precarity, where over 43% of the island lives in poverty, one-third of the island's residents are food insecure, and the unemployment rate is consistently nearly double that in the United States. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I definitely recommend reading through this document. I will post it as a link in the description down below. But they even go into the full extent of the Wall Street predation that had occurred that made Promesa become a law in the first place, and how Puerto Rico's debt had spiraled out of control. So, essentially, what we have here is that Promesa has made it so that PR is being controlled by an oversight board that is unelected and uses austerity measures to further extract resources from the population of Puerto Rico in favor of Wall Street and bankers. Now, to make matters worse in terms of this imperial and colonial tactics that we're seeing here, there's Act 22, which sets Puerto Rico up as a tax haven through the year 2035. Now, we have here for Act 22 that the Individual Investors Act, also known as Act 22, seeks to attract new residents to Puerto Rico by providing a total exemption from Puerto Rico income taxes on all passive income realized or accrued after such individuals become bona fide residents of Puerto Rico. This relocation should result in new local investments in real estate, services, and other consumer products. Supposedly, that's what's supposed to happen, but that's not exactly what's happened at all. And in capital injections into PR's banking sector, all of which is supposed to stimulate the economy of PR. Now, tax exemption will make it so that new residents enjoy 100% tax exemption on passive income, including all dividends and interest. Interest and dividends that qualify as PR source income will not be subject to federal income taxation under Section 933 of the IRS tax code. Meanwhile, for capital gains, all capital gains accrued after becoming a new resident will be 100% exempt from PR's taxes. These gains will not be subject to federal taxes as well. So this, of course, encourages wealthy, usually white Americans from the United States to set up in Puerto Rico and colonize the island, as they will not have to pay virtually any tax while completely outcompeting Puerto Ricans who still have to pay these taxes. And as I mentioned before when disaster struck, instead of releasing the FEMA funds, they've withheld a good chunk of it. And between all of this, nothing has happened to fix things since Hurricane Maria happened. That said, let's take a little bit of time to shift over and shift the focus onto privatization. So, for privatization, as part of this austerity measure under Promesa, the board decided to privatize Puerto Rico's previously public electric grid. So we have here the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, was a publicly owned and operated corporation which had been responsible for providing electricity to PR since 1941. The board recently oversaw the privatization of PREPA's operations, mere days after the private Canadian company Luma Energy began a 15-year contract to provide power in Puerto Rico. Now, more than 1 million people were affected by power outages and blackouts stemming from an electrical station fire. The board's austerity cuts directly hampered the island's ability to respond. The public utility previously employed over 2,000 linemen. Following austerity cuts, that was decreased to 700 workers, and today Luma Energy only employs 300 workers responding to this outage. Now, even though Puerto Ricans already pay almost twice as much for electricity than other U.S. customers, the board has consistently pushed for steep rate increases. In previous years, the board recommended a 13% increase in electric utility prices in order to repay bondholders who owned PREPA debt, and over a year ago, PREPA reached a second restructuring deal with its creditors that included a fixed transition charge. By some estimates, customers would pay $986 more per year as a result of that agreement. In early January 2021, when Puerto Rico Energy Bureau approved another rate hike on customers, Across other public utilities, the board has also called for regressive toll increases on roads and implemented yearly water rate increases since 2018. So yeah, Promesa's solution to the electric grid was to contract a company without the consent of the people who proceeded to raise their rates and decrease their workforce. This happens every time we see privatization of essential services. And to make matters worse, the force they are bringing in to actually do this labor is largely white people from the United States instead of paying Puerto Rican workers. We can see this because if you look at the invoices, you can actually see American Relocation Connections, LLC, with over $80,000 on August 3rd, 2021's bill. Now, this is on every single bill. You can go back and look at their website and see the different bills. Each one of them has these large amounts of invoices ranging somewhere between $10,000 and $115,000. And so basically, they're bringing people in, they're relocating people from the United States into Puerto Rico in order to have these workers come in and essentially colonize the island. So, next up on this, when we talk about privatization, we need to talk about solar panels. Now, the alternative to what's being done on the electric grid is to use solar panels. Solar panels are available on the island. But because of how terrible the electric grid, privatization has led to a massive price increase in solar panels. This means that only the wealthiest people have access to them. And many instances, that means that the very same people moving to the island via either Act 22 or those who are relocated by companies like Luma are more than likely the ones with access to individual solar panels, leaving a lot of the population left to fend for themselves when a disaster like what just happened happens. That said, a potential solution was presented a long while ago. In fact, almost 5 years ago when the first disaster had happened with Maria. Now, the issue for the electric grid is instead of having individuals use solar panels and being otherwise disconnected from the grid, people could use or could form communal microgrids that don't have to rely on large power lines that can be knocked over in hurricanes and other storms. This, in combination with worker cooperative electric grids that would allow people to have democratic control over their power companies, would certainly make for a far better outcome than anything this austerity-based privatization has done. However, this is the type of colonial imperial practices that we consistently see by the United States, not just in PR, but in other parts of the globe, where they bring in these types of privatization measures that end up helping and support and lift up US corporations and US citizens over the other populations that they are overall hurting. Finally, we have climate change as a thing that we need to talk about. While we can't say for sure that this particular hurricane, that Hurricane Fiona, would or would not have happened if we didn't have climate change. What we can say for sure is that hurricanes like Fiona have certainly become more intense with time, especially because it's holding on to that much more water. So what we have here is how much water vapor the air can hold is based on temperature. Warmer air temperatures can hold more water vapor. The increased moisture in the air leads to more intense rainfall, especially during extreme events. As the air continues to warm due to climate change, hurricanes can hold more water vapor, producing more intense rainfall rates in a storm. So, when we see Puerto Rico receive over 30 inches of rain, that is causing mass flooding from a Category 1 storm, that is likely exacerbated by climate change. In addition, this type of mass flooding on some of the mountainous surfaces of Puerto Rico is likely to cause things like landslides, which can further devastate homes and infrastructure. Then we need to factor in that there's been an increase in deforestation with a lot of the population that's moved in, buying up areas near beaches and trying to form resorts and all such things, all of these business ventures that have been moving into the island over the past 5 years. And as we know with deforestation can make landslides much worse, as we've seen in Appalachia recently. Now, add to this the lack of response over the past 5 years due to the failure of Promesa and the privatization and austerity measures that has eliminated services, and it's really unsurprising that this happened again, and in fact is just adding a pool of disasters that Puerto Rico now needs to recover from. In fact, it was designed to happen this way, just as most colonial projects are. The fact is that the only real solution is going to be a decision that comes from Puerto Ricans for Puerto Ricans. The more that this needs to move away from US and imperial and colonial rule. There's no way that the US is going to come up with a positive solution for Puerto Rico at this point. For over 120 years, Puerto Rico has been subject to these types of practices, and Promesa and Act 22 and everything else that I've talked about, including Luma, is just the latest attempt to control the people and the island. All I can say going forward is solidarity with the people of Puerto Rico in their struggle, and hopefully they can find independence, a true form of independence in the near future. Oh yeah, and fuera Luma. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord where we have political conversations like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.